Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Kilayim. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Daled. In yesterday's Mishnah, we learned the halachot for planting a row of one kind of vegetable in a field of another kind of vegetable. Today, the Mishnah is going to teach us the halacha for planting rows containing different kinds of vegetables next to each other on an empty field, in an empty field. Now, these rows of each kind are separated from rows of the other kind by the 6 tefachim distance. However, there are situations where even the 6 tefachim distance still will be asur according to some opinions. The Mishnah is going to give us 3 cases. Case number 1. If someone plants 2 rows of cucumbers, or 2 rows of gourds, and 2 rows of Egyptian beans next to each other, mutar, that's permitted. And the Mefarshim explain, because 2 rows of one kind of vegetable growing next to each other look like a field. Since each of these vegetables, it's its own field, is separated from the other by 6 tefachim, they're not kilayim, even though their leaves will reach each other. And the Mefarshim continue to explain, when you have 2 adjacent rows of the same species stand out and give the impression of being a field of their own, even though the leaves of their species are going to be spread out towards each other, they do not look like kilayim. The next case the Mishnah gives, shura shel kishuim, but if you plant 1 row of cucumbers, shura shel diluim, 1 row of gourds, shura shel pora mitzri, and 1 row of Egyptian beans, asur, the Mishnah says that's asur, because even though the rows are separated from each other by 6 tefachim, since the leaves of these kinds of vegetables extend outward and they overlap each other, they look like a jumble of different kinds of vegetables that were planted together all at once. And since there is only a single row of each kind, they do not have this distinction of looking like separate fields. Therefore, planting them in this way is kilayim, even though they're separated from each other by 6 tefachim. And the Mefarshim point out, if you look at the Rav and the Rambam, when the leaves of these plants are spread out and mixed with each other, they make the 6 tefachim separation between the rows less obvious because they're all tangled. So people who look at these rows, they don't see them as distinct rows of different kinds of vegetables, but as a number of different kinds of vegetables growing together without order in one field, if their seeds as if their seeds have been tossed down together, and that makes it look like kilayim. However, when there are 2 rows of each kind, they look like separate fields of different vegetables that were deliberately planted that way. So even though their leaves spread over the gap between them, the separation between them stand out more clearly. This is how the Rav Mibartenura and the Rambam explain this Mishnah. The third case the Mishnah gives is shura shel kishuim. If you plant 1 row of cucumbers, shura shel diluim, 1 row of gourds, shura shel pora mitzri, 1 row of Egyptian beans, v'shura shel kishuim, and 1 final row of cucumbers. So as opposed to the second case, we had 3 rows, 1 of cucumbers, 1 of gourds, and 1 of Egyptian beans. Here in this third case, we have 1 cucumber, 1 gourd, 1 Egyptian bean, and again a cucumber row. Rabbi Eliezer matir v'chachamim osrin. Rabbi Eliezer permits it, whereas the sages prohibit it, because since the outer 2 rows are both cucumbers, Rabbi Eliezer views it as combining them to make a field of cucumbers. The other 2 are therefore considered, or they're viewed as 2 rows of other vegetables planted in a field of cucumbers. As long as there is a 6 tefach separation between the inserted rows and the rest of the field, it's mutar, like we learned in the previous Mishnah, whereas the Chachamim do not consider this to be a field of cucumbers because the 2 rows of cucumbers are not next to one another. They are one all the way at one end and the other one all the way at the other end. That is again how the Rav and the Rambam explain this Mishnah. On to Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah now is going to discuss a technique that makes it mutar for 2 different species to grow near each other. Notea adam kishut udlat b'toch guma achat. A person can plant a cucumber and a gourd in the same hole. Now, even though these 2 species in general are kilayim with each other, like we learned, provided that this plant leans to this side of the hole and the other plant leans to the other side of the hole, meaning provided you force the stem of one plant to grow in one direction and the stem of the other plant to grow in a different direction. And the Mefarshim explain that this technique works even with cucumbers and gourds, even though the natural tendency of their stems and leaves is to spread out and become tangled with each other. Obviously, it goes without saying that it's effective with other vegetables that don't have this tendency. If you see the Rambam and his halachot of Hilchot Kilayim, chapter 4, halacha 5, and also his commentary here, the chidush of the Mishnah is that even though cucumbers and gourds, it's hard to make their leaves not tangle with other plants. If you can train it, if you can force it to be on opposite sides of each other, that's allowed, and all the most of our other vegetables don't have this tendency. And the Mishnah continues, V'notes se'ar shel zo lekan v'shel zo lekan, and he makes the hair, which is the leaves of this plant, lean here, and the leaves of this plant lean here. So you make the actual plant lean, you make the hair of the plant, meaning the leaves lean. Shekol ma she'asu chachamim lo gazru el mipnei marit ayin, because the only time the chachamim prohibited by kilayim was when there was a problem of marit ayin, suspicion of violating kilayim. Now, kilayim is only asu when the two species appear to be mixed, when the rabbis prohibited it. However, since two plants growing in different directions do not appear to be mixed, planting them together in one whole is mutar. And the Mefarshim go at length to explain that the isur d'oraita, the biblical prohibition of kilayim of seeds, kilei zra'im, is only when the plants look mingled. Now, this is the primary concern the Chachamim had in mind when they decreed what's called kilayim and what's not, meaning what separations are valid and what's not. When you train the stems and the leaves to grow in different directions, you eliminated the prohibition of kilayim because there's no marit ayin, there's no appearance of a mixture. Now, if you learn the Mishnah like this, basically it comes out the Mishnah is defining the rule of midoraita kilayim. Different species next to one another are not kilayim unless they look mingled, like the Chachamim explained. However, other people explain the Mishnah differently, that it's only defining the rabbinic decree of kilayim, but on the biblical level, nothing is kilayim unless the two seeds of two different species are planted together at the same time. It's called dropping from the hand. All other situations are only forbidden rabbinically. And they go on to explain that these sages would added and prohibited any formation that looks mixed, because again, marit ayin, and according to them, our Mishnah is talking about a case where the two seeds were not placed in the hole at the same time, but if you are allowed them to grow together, people will think that they were planted together. However, when a person trains the stems and leaves to go in different directions, this concern disappears. The way we were learning this Mishnayot follow the first view that we said, that this is teaching us mideoraita, what's considered kilayim, only when the plants look mingled. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen v'amen.